My name's Alex Harris and I'm the Director of Baptist Church Planting at St Hills Centre for Church Planting, and I'm also a Regional Minister for the Yorkshire Baptist Association, so I particularly appreciate the invitation to speak to you because I know that we'll come from different church traditions which are stronger together. I'm also very much a local church planter and pastor. For 15 years I've served churches in the UK, and for about 10 years before that I served churches in China and overseas, and right now we're planting a church actually called Lydia House, based out of our home behind us here. We've been about 3 years living in the centre of Leeds. I've been asked to share a little bit on a piece of research that we did over a number of years and ultimately got published in this little accessible book called On This Rock. In essence, we surveyed and interviewed quite deeply some of the fastest growing churches within our Baptist family, within the movement of about 2,000 churches nationally. But not just churches which were growing quickly, but churches which were growing quickly through seeing new people become Christians. So we were quite strict on that and placed some quite demanding criteria on what meant the church was actually growing, kingdom growing, in terms of new faith in new people. What we were looking for was two things. What was repeated across all those growing churches? What characteristics seemed to be the same? What kind of instincts did they all share? Some of those instincts were similar to lots of churches, whether they were growing or not, and some of those instincts were quite bespoke to these growing churches. So first we looked at what was true of all of them, irrespective of their differences in terms of context or socio-economic makeup or where they were located in the country. What was the same about them, repeated? But then secondly, what was also repeatable by other churches? So not only what was true of all these growing churches, but what could be true of any church, of any kind of description or makeup or denomination or location. So it's no good for us to find something like a growing church is in a university city. That's a great thing, but it's not a repeatable trait. Lots of churches, most churches, are not in a university city, or at least not in the university district of a university city. So what we were looking for was the traits that were repeated, but also repeatable, that other churches could pick them up, and under God's grace and goodness, maybe that would catalyse the same kind of growth. And we actually discovered 7 of these traits, and as I say, we took the research and we put it into this little book called On This Rock to invite ordinary churches, whether they were conventional churches, whether they were micro churches, missional communities, disciple-making movements, whatever shape of church they were, but particularly that conventional, traditional church in mind, so that any church could engage with this and grapple with some of those principles. What I'd like to do is talk about 2 of those principles, have some questions that might aid your reflections on those 2 principles, and also think about some of the sacrifices, some of the cost that comes with them. So what's the first of the 2 that I want to highlight? It's this. We call it, let your evangelist voice be heard. Consistently across those growing churches, what we noticed was that they had the evangelist voice in decision-making and culture-setting spaces in the life of the church. That each and every one of those churches, in some way, shape or form, invited the evangelist voice to shape culture and to inform decisions quite significantly in terms of the life and purpose and mission of the church. In some of those cases, it was in fact the minister, the employed accredited minister, who themselves was a gifted evangelist. In other cases, it was a significant volunteer leader, or one of those individuals that every church has who's a real influencer because of the relationships they had, but they were an evangelist, and therefore their instincts, their lean, their way they informed the church's culture and decision making was always pushing in that direction. Now, our reflection on this is the importance of this evangelist voice is a great corrective between where our churches have got to and where the Bible might encourage us to be when it comes to leadership. I think I noticed 2 things about the Bible's understanding of leadership in a local church context, of many others, but one of them is it's always in the plural. It's always leaders or shepherds or deacons or overseers or elders. It's always in the plural. And yet quite often in church life of all denominations, we move to a point where the vicar or the minister or the pastor has a disproportionate singular voice into the direction of the church. I don't think that's what the Bible teaches about leadership, but it does seem where lots of our churches have found themselves in terms of leadership. The second observation I make about the Bible is not only is there a plurality of people, there's a plurality of gifts. That the voices that make up that leadership team are highly diverse in the gifting, the emphasis that they bring. There's a number of different models of this, I think, that we see in the Bible. One of the most well-known is what's sometimes described with the acronym APEST. You find it in Ephesians chapter 4, where we're told that Jesus has given to his church apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, and teachers. 5 distinct kind of voices, of gifts, of leans that church leadership should give equal weight and attention to. And yet somehow, over time, what's happened in lots of UK churches, and it's happened over such a long time, we're often immune, we don't even observe its reality, and we don't even think of it as perhaps unhealthy. What's happened is we've leaned to a point that the most dominant voices are the pastor, the teacher, and the administrator. That actually what we have understood about leadership in our churches is a pastor with a pastoral gift who is able to teach the Bible is the person we employ and then often give a stronger voice to. And we bring alongside them someone who can do the administrative or compliance, the safeguarding, the financial monitoring of the life of the church. In our Baptist circles, that's an office holder called a church secretary. You might find it in Anglican circles in terms of the church warden. And so what's happened over time is our churches in the UK, and I'm talking about 200 years of history, what can happen is singular voices dominate instead of a plurality of voices, and those singular voices lean towards pastoral care, teaching the Bible well, and being organised safely and securely. Now those voices are really good. This is not about muting the pastor, the teacher, or the administrator, not at all. But it is about bringing the evangelist voice into equal proportion in the life of the church. And what we've noticed in all those churches that grew, some in rural contexts, some in urban, some in city centres, some in very affluent areas, some in much more deprived context, some of them doing conventional or traditional church expressions, some doing fresh expressions or micro churches or monastic expressions. But in all of them, the evangelist voice was heard in the decision-making and culture-setting life of the church. That was true in all those churches that grew and is repeatable for any church to do. So now my question is, how would you set about doing that? I think there's 3 things that you can do. Number 1, identify. So here's the question, who could you identify in your church who is an evangelist? Identify the evangelist in your church. That's the lady who always has someone to bring to Alpha. It's the mum who's always talking about the conversations she'd had at the school gate that end up being about Jesus. One of the best evangelists I knew was a 14-year-old who constantly brought friends to the youth group. Identify the evangelist and find an appropriate way to get their voice heard in the leadership, decision-making and culture-setting space of the church. Now, of course, those people might not have all the characteristics of being appointed as an official leader, but you can invite them in informally to consult. With that 14-year-old, I used to go round to his house and sit with his mum and go through the leadership agenda that the team would be talking about later in the week and just get his insight and thoughts on it. It was really informative. So, who is it that you could identify in the life of your church who is an evangelist and you can bring their voice to bear in an appropriate way? Secondly, what about borrow? Can you borrow an evangelist? You might say, well, Alex, we don't have an evangelist in our church community, in our missional community or our conventional church. We can't identify someone. What about borrow an evangelist? Could you speak to your archdeacon or your regional leader, whoever that might be, the local churches in your area? Who have they got who's an evangelist? Could you ask to borrow them? Have them zoom in to a meeting or pay their petrol expenses to join you around an important discussion? Can you borrow the evangelist voice so they inform your culture setting and decision making? Or thirdly, you can play the what would the evangelist say game. You can pretend. One of the things I've found is as you discuss something as a leadership team or a group, before you make a settled decision, simply say, well, what would the evangelist say about this? And 9 times out of 10, I think we get it right. So this first trait I'm offering you is that all these churches that saw significant growth through people being converted had the evangelist voice heard in the culture setting and decision-making places of the church's life. And I'm suggesting you can do that quite simply in your context by either identifying the evangelist and inviting them appropriately into your leadership context, or borrow the evangelists and listen to what they have to say about significant decisions, or simply play what would the evangelist say game and pretend to be an evangelist and discover 9 times out of 10 you know what their reflection might be. Just on this, I want to encourage you that if you are an accredited minister, an ordained minister, and you think, well, I'm actually not gifted as an evangelist, but I do see the importance of this, I think the Bible has some deep encouragement for you in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 8, where Paul writes to Timothy himself predominantly a pastor teacher, and he says to Timothy, but do the work of an evangelist. There seems to be the capacity in God's grace and goodness that he can reshape some of our gifting so that when necessary we can do the work of an evangelist, even if it's not our primary instinct. And so I do want to encourage you, if you're a vicar or curate or a training incumbent or whatever it might be, you're in that set-apart ministry, there does seem to be the suggestion of a good promise for you about embracing the work of an evangelist as you serve your church. Just a note before we move on to the second principle I wanted to highlight. Where does the sacrifice come with this? Well, I think some of the things I've noted is as the evangelist voice is more and more heard and responded to and shapes the culture and direction of the church, there's many great joys, not least more people do become Christians. There is a direct correlation with it. But some of the sacrifices include a loss of preference and comfort for the existing Christians. Things change about the way things are done, and they don't always change better for the group that is already part of the church. Not least because you're reshaping yourselves for the bigger group that is not part of the church. So you need to pause and spend time trying to name those things together and grieve their loss. Often they're good things, but they're getting in the way of the great thing of Jesus being made known to new people. A second sacrifice I've noticed is you'll begin to lose the code language you have about your theological location. What do I mean by that? I mean, every group, whether it's church or any other group in society, one of the ways it creates glue and relational bonds with one another is by having certain language that instinctively and simply locates itself compared to other groups. And this happens really strongly in church communities. Our tribe or our flavour or our emphasis comes with simple words which are markers in the sand, say this is who we are. So if I say Holy Communion, or Eucharist, or the Lord's Supper, or the family meal, I may be describing exactly the same thing, but I'm describing it with particular language which is distinct to particular groupings of Christians. And that language is quite precious to them because of what it describes. Or let me give you another example. If I say preaching of the word, the Bible talk, God's message, opening up the scriptures, our Bible reflection today. All those might well be describing a very, very similar event that's occurring in our church on a Sunday morning in a conventional context, the sermon. And yet each one of them is kind of code language, a simplification that says this is who we are, this is our particular understanding. It's like the Sibboleth, the code word that locates us and creates our sense of community with each other. Well, as the evangelist voice is heard more and more, and the capacity to communicate with the outsider becomes the priority, lots of that code language is lost and preferred language comes into play, new language. But for many, many churches, I've found that is a bigger challenge than you would have thought. Because the changing of those simple words or descriptions speaks to a deeper reality, a sense of identity that then starts to get rocked or upset. Again, you need to name these things as best you can beforehand. Name them as good things, but recognize they may well change as the church begins to seek to grow through new people become Christians, and the evangelist voice, which is constantly reinterpreting language, begins to be heard in the culture setting and leadership context of the church. So that's the first one, and I've deliberately spent longer on letting the evangelist voice be heard, because in all of that research we actually identified that as the most significant one. Getting the evangelist voice, either identify, borrow or pretend, into the culture setting and decision-making spaces of your church's life. Secondly, is I want to emphasize the principle that these churches reorganized more often than you'd think. So one of these characteristics that was true of all these churches that grew is to carry on growing, and this is often the carry on growing important bit, is that they reorganized more often than you would think. In fact, they reorganized themselves to continue doing the same thing they'd always done. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, as a church starts to grow, and perhaps the way that God is growing its church, let's say, is through really great relationships, people feeling a sense of belonging and hospitality and welcome and being seen and known. Well, as the number of people in that church grows, the capacity to do that reduces. If on a Sunday morning in a conventional church there's 30 of you, it's very easy for everyone to know everyone and know a little bit about each person. But once that group is 70, that becomes much, much harder. And once it's 100, it's impossible. So what you need to do is to change before you plateau more often than you would thought to continue to do the same thing you've always done. An example of this in the Bible is found in Acts 6. It seems like in those early days of the church growing significantly, one of the key ways God was growing the church was through its compassion and love for the widows. People found a place of belonging and deep practical support. But as the church grew bigger and there was more of those people with those needs, the group of leaders, called the apostles at that point, became overstretched. They couldn't pray, teach the Bible, and care for the widows because simply the number of people had gone up. And so to carry on doing the same things, praying and teaching the Bible and looking after the widows, they changed the way they did those things. In Acts 6, they bring in a middle management. At that point, it's called the deacons to pick up those things, to allow them to continue to do the same things they'd always done. And these churches that grew significantly through conversion growth did exactly that. For many churches, it would have felt like they were constantly reimagining themselves, innovating and creating change for the sake of change. But actually, what they were doing was regularly pausing and saying, as we've grown with more people becoming Christians, what do we need to do differently so we can keep doing the same things we've always done? Whatever those things might be that were important in the story of how that church grew. So what does that mean in terms of some of the sacrifices? Well, changing often always brings relational tension. People often don't like to change. And leaders often absorb and understand change much, much more quickly than those who are following them and assert that change too strongly too early. So one of the things as leadership teams that you need to think about is, what does it mean to create a culture in our church, in our missional community or microchurch, where the relationships and trust are strong enough that the organisational change can happen quick enough. It's not actually about having brilliant structures and systems and rotas and administration, as important those things are. It's actually about having depth of relationship and trust So when you bring about that change, people don't feel like they're breaking relationship with you. So that's one of the sacrifices or risks that this change brings. Let me pause in my last minute and just invite you to get your wits around you and just remind you where we've gone. As I say, we did this piece of significant research translated into a very simple book called On This Rock, which identified the repeated and repeatable traits of churches that were growing through conversion growth at a very significant rate. I've shared 2 of the 7 findings. First of all, and most importantly, the evangelist voice was heard in the decision-making and culture-setting spaces in the life of the church. And secondly, that they reorganised more often than you had thought, so they could continue to do the very things that God was using to grow them in the first place. I really hope these reflections have been useful for you today.